There are stars that rise slowly, shaping their glow over time. And then there are stars like Carole Lombard, brilliant from the moment they appear, blazing with a force that feels almost supernatural, and extinguished long before the world is ready to let them go. Her story is not just the tale of a Hollywood legend. It is the portrait of a woman whose light refused to dim, even when fate carved obstacles into her path. Born Jane Alice Peters, she arrived in Hollywood at an age when most children were still learning who they were. By her teens, she was already working in silent films. And then, at 16, everything shattered. A violent car accident tore into her face, leaving a wound that could have ended her career before it truly began. But Carole Lombard was built differently. Instead of hiding, she fought back. Instead of fading, she transformed. The scar that should have defined her became the spark that ignited her reinvention. She refused to be a porcelain goddess. She chose speed, wit, irreverence, and intelligence. In an era that demanded softness, she spoke fast, thought faster, and laughed at rules she never intended to follow. She wasn't merely an actress. She was a force of comedic innovation, the woman who would redefine the screwball genre and leave critics scrambling to explain her brilliance. Yet behind the humor was a striking emotional depth, a fierce devotion to the people she loved, and a sense of duty that would lead her into the heart of America's wartime effort. Her destiny, like her talent, moved quickly, too quickly. Carole Lombard lived like a flame, bright, warm, impossible to ignore. And like a flame, she left a glow that never truly went out. Carole Lombard's story begins far from the glitter of studio backlots in the quieter streets of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Born Jane Alice Peters on October 6, 1908, she was a child with restless energy and a spark that seemed too large for the Midwestern world around her. When her parents separated, her mother moved the children to Los Angeles, a decision that would place Carole dangerously close to destiny. In the warm California sun, she blossomed into an athletic, adventurous girl, the kind who climbed trees, outran boys, and seemed incapable of staying still. Her entry into film was almost accidental. Discovered by a director while playing baseball with neighborhood kids, the young Jane stepped into the silent film world with the fearlessness of someone who didn't yet understand the magnitude of where she was headed. She began appearing in small roles, absorbing the mechanics of stardom like a pupil studying a language she already instinctively spoke. But early Hollywood was not kind to young women, and the studio system, rigid, demanding, unforgiving, expected perfection from its ingenues. At 16, fate struck with a brutality that could have ended everything. A severe car accident slashed open the left side of her face, leaving a deep wound that doctors feared would scar permanently. In the 1920s, a facial injury was more than a medical crisis. It was a professional death sentence. Studios needed flawless faces, and the girl who had barely begun was suddenly told that her future might already be over. But Carole Lombard refused to surrender. She embraced physical therapy, endured painful treatments, and experimented with makeup and lighting techniques to conceal the scar. For a time, she stepped away from major roles, but she refused to disappear from the industry entirely. Instead, she pushed her way back into work through determination alone, taking small parts, bit roles, and background appearances, anything that kept her in motion. The accident had changed her, not just physically but emotionally. She emerged sharper, quicker, more defiant. If Hollywood demanded perfection, she would give them something better, authenticity. She transformed her vulnerability into fuel and turned her frustration into humor, using laughter as both shield and weapon. Directors noticed her timing, her spark, and the way she carried scenes even when she had only a few lines. Slowly, Hollywood began to understand that Carole Lombard brought something no scar could erase. Her shift into comedy wasn't planned, it was instinctive. She discovered she had the rare ability to deliver lines with rapid-fire precision, to twist a simple phrase into something unforgettable, and to elevate even the weakest scripts with sheer personality. When she joined Max Sennett's troupe, the legendary King of Comedy, she found the perfect training ground. Sennett valued energy over perfection, improvisation over stiffness, boldness over beauty. Under his guidance, she honed her comedic reflexes, learned how to land a joke, take a fall, and steal a scene. Hollywood took notice. By the late 1920s, she was no longer the girl recovering from a disfiguring accident. She was becoming the woman who would redefine the industry's expectations. She had survived her trial by fire and emerged with a deeper understanding of herself. Her early struggles shaped her into the Carole Lombard the world would come to adore. Resilient, outspoken, fiercely humorous, and entirely her own creation. This rebirth marked the beginning of a meteoric rise, one fueled not by privilege or protection, but by grit. And as her star began to climb, Hollywood realized something profound. This was not a woman to underestimate. She had already survived what should have destroyed her. Everything that came next, she would meet head-on, with speed, style, and that unmistakable spark. Carole Lombard did not simply rise, she erupted. The woman Hollywood once doubted because of a facial scar soon became the very definition of bold, modern screen presence. As sound cinema swept across the industry, many silent-era actors struggled to adapt. Lombard, however, thrived. The world finally heard the speed, sharpness, and electricity in her voice, and everything about her suddenly made sense. Her wit, her rhythm, her kinetic energy. She wasn't born for silence, she was born for velocity. Her ascent crystallized with 20th Century, 1934, the film that announced to audiences and critics alike that Carole Lombard was not a typical leading lady. She demonstrated comedic timing that felt almost dangerous in its precision. She didn't merely deliver lines, she fired them, each one sharpened with intelligence and an irreverent edge that became her signature. Hollywood had never seen a woman weaponize humor with such grace and intensity. Then came My Man Godfrey, 1936, the role that transformed her from respected actress to undeniable phenomenon. Her performance was a masterclass in screwball comedy, fast, unpredictable, emotionally layered beneath the chaotic charm. She earned an Academy Award nomination, but the real prize was something deeper. Proof that she had elevated comedy into an art form, that she could dazzle without sacrificing depth, that she was, in every sense, a force. But her career was only one part of her reinvention. Off-screen, Lombard crafted a persona that defied the polished, tightly controlled image expected of women in the studio era. She was unapologetically herself. She swore like a sailor, laughed loudly, said exactly what she thought, and refused to shrink to meet anyone's comfort. Journalists adored her for it. Co-stars respected her. Directors feared and loved her in equal measure. Hollywood, for once, had no choice but to adjust to a woman who refused to play by the old rules. Her humor was not an act. It was armor, expression, and philosophy. She turned film sets into playgrounds, orchestrating elaborate pranks that became legendary. During one film shoot, she even hired an entire crew to stage a fake scene purely to prank a friend. People who worked with her said she lived with a spark in her eyes that never seemed to go out, and that spark was contagious. She didn't just make movies, she made memories. And every person who crossed her path seemed to carry a piece of her energy with them. Fashion, too, became part of her reinvention. Carole Lombard had an instinctive understanding of what made a woman look modern. She embraced sleek silhouettes, satin gowns, minimalistic lines, and a style warmth that magazines like Vogue praised relentlessly. Hollywood loved glamour, but Lombard brought something different. a sophistication that felt effortless, elegant, and refreshing. She wasn't playing dress-up, she was setting trends. And audiences responded. Her box office appeal skyrocketed, and by the late 1930s, she was among the highest-paid actresses in the world. Not because she was the most conventionally beautiful, nor because she was the studio's safe choice, but because she was unmistakably Carole Lombard. She had taken every obstacle, every underestimation, and every expectation and turned them into building blocks of a legacy shaped entirely on her own terms. Her rise was not the product of luck or timing. It was the result of fire, willpower, and a kind of fearlessness that still feels rare in Hollywood lore. By the time the decade neared its end, one truth had become clear. Carole Lombard had reinvented not only herself, but the very idea of what a leading woman in Hollywood could be. She wasn't just a star. She was a revolution wrapped in satin and laughter. For all her brilliance on screen, Carole Lombard's private life held a tenderness and vulnerability that the public rarely saw. Beneath the fast-talking charm and razor-sharp wit lived a woman who loved deeply, fiercely, and with a devotion that often surprised those who only knew her as Hollywood's comedic firecracker. Her first marriage, to actor William Powell in 1931, was a union of opposites. Powell, sophisticated and measured; Lombard, unpredictable and quick-witted. Their marriage lasted only 2 years, but their connection endured far beyond the divorce. It became one of Hollywood's most elegant friendships. They respected each other, supported each other, and shared an affection so genuine that even separation couldn't erase it. Powell later gifted her a falcon, an unusual but deeply personal gesture that reflected the eccentric warmth of their bond. It was one of those rare Hollywood relationships that proved love could transform rather than vanish. But the great love of Carole Lombard's life arrived in the form of a man as iconic as she was, Clark Gable. Their chemistry began years before their romance did, built on playful banter and mutual daring. While filming No Man of Her Own in 1932, they teased each other relentlessly, trading jokes and jabs like two people testing the edges of something inevitable. Yet the timing wasn't right. Both were in other relationships, their lives running on parallel tracks. Years later, destiny finally aligned. Their romance, once it ignited, became one of Hollywood's most beloved love stories. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was real. Gable, the king of Hollywood, found in Lombard someone who saw him not as a star, but as a man. She teased him, grounded him, made him laugh with that signature mischief only she possessed. He, in turn, admired her strength, her candor, and her refusal to be intimidated by his fame. They married in 1939 in a ceremony that mirrored their personalities. Simple, sincere, and free of Hollywood excess. Instead of living in a mansion dripping with chandeliers, they chose a ranch in Encino. There, far from studio bosses and flashbulbs, they tended chickens, planted trees, rode horses, and built a life filled with ordinary moments, the kind that become extraordinary when shared with the right person. Friends who visited the ranch often said it was the happiest either of them had ever been. Carole complemented Gable's steady masculinity with her wit and warmth, while he balanced her fire with stability. Their home was full of laughter, pranks, and a sense of peace both had long craved. Lombard once joked that she had married not the king of Hollywood, but the farmhand who happens to look like Clark Gable. It was one of the few places where they could live not as icons, but as themselves. Yet even in happiness, Lombard carried a profound emotional depth. She was protective of Gable, understanding better than anyone the weight of fame he bore. She was supportive of his career, but she also kept him grounded in a world prone to illusions. And Gable, in turn, cherished her boldness, her honesty, and the lightness she brought to his life. Their love story was powerful, not because it was perfect, but because it was human, passionate, playful, deeply loyal, and full of genuine affection. In a town built on fantasy, Carole and Clark found something astonishingly real. But love, no matter how strong, cannot shield anyone from destiny. And soon, the world would pull Carole Lombard into a moment of history far larger than Hollywood, a moment that would bring her courage and fate to the forefront. As the 1940s unfolded, the world shifted into darkness. War swept across continents, and even Hollywood, a place built to escape reality, felt its shadow. Many stars lent their names to charity drives or posed for patriotic photographs, but Carole Lombard did something different. She stepped forward with the same fierce determination that had carried her through injury, reinvention, and love. When the United States entered World War II, she became one of the industry's most passionate, relentless advocates for national unity. Carole understood influence. She knew that the same charisma that made audiences laugh could inspire them to act. And so she volunteered to lead a major war bond tour, a commitment that demanded stamina, travel, and emotional labor. She didn't just appear at events. She ignited them. She spoke from stages with fire in her voice, rallying crowds with humor, urgency, and sincerity. She shook hands until her fingers ached, signed autographs endlessly, and transformed every appearance into a call to action. Newspapers reported record turnouts wherever she went. People trusted her. They listened. On January 15, 1942, in her home state of Indiana, Carole shattered fundraising expectations by selling more than $2 million worth of war bonds in a single day, a staggering achievement at the time. She had become a symbol not just of Hollywood glamour, but of American spirit. The government recognized her efforts as heroic, and Carole, exhausted yet exhilarated, prepared to return to Los Angeles. Her team urged caution. They recommended traveling back by train. Safer, slower, predictable. But Carole was restless. She missed Clark, missed home, missed the quiet of their ranch. Flying would get her back sooner. And so, with her mother and several others from her group, she made the decision that would become one of the most haunting pivots in Hollywood history. We fly. 2 simple words. A choice that felt practical in the moment, but would echo through the decades like a whispered prophecy. On January 16, 1942, Carole Lombard boarded TWA Flight 3. The aircraft lifted into the night, carrying with it one of the brightest spirits Hollywood had ever known. Somewhere over Nevada, a fatal navigational error occurred. The plane veered off course, its crew unaware of the mountains ahead. In the darkness of the desert, against the jagged outline of Potosi Mountain, destiny closed in. The crash was instantaneous. There were no survivors. News traveled swiftly, first as rumor, then as confirmation, and finally as national grief. America had lost not just a beloved actress, but a woman who had given everything she had to a cause larger than herself. Headlines mourned her as a patriot, a symbol of courage, a civilian hero lost in the line of duty. Hollywood mourned the loss of its brilliant comedic force. But no one felt the impact more than Clark Gable. He was reportedly devastated beyond words, collapsing when he learned the truth. Friends said he looked like a man whose heart had been forcibly torn from his chest. Days later, he traveled to the crash site, a barren, wind-swept mountainside where fragments of the plane and of the life he shared with Carole lay scattered. Something inside him broke there in the cold silence of Potosi. Carole Lombard's final act, one of patriotism, bravery, and urgency, became a moment frozen in American memory. She had lived with speed, humor, and fire. And in the end, fate met her with the same intensity. The world would feel the tremor of that loss for generations. The morning after the TWA Flight 3 disaster, Hollywood felt unreal. A silence hung over the studios, a kind of stunned disbelief that someone as alive as Carole Lombard could vanish so suddenly. Radios repeated the news in solemn tones. Newspapers printed her photograph across front pages. The contrast between her radiant smile and the brutal tragedy, too painful for many to reconcile. America had lost a star, but Clark Gable had lost his heart. Gable's grief was immediate and overwhelming. He refused to accept the reality until he could face it himself. When he arrived at the crash site on Potosi Mountain, he was led across rocky terrain littered with fragments of metal, personal belongings, and the cruel remains of what had once been a routine flight. Witnesses later said he stood there in heavy silence, shoulders shaking, as if trying to summon Carole's laughter in a place where no sound existed. That moment changed him forever. He insisted on identifying what pieces he could, a task haunting enough to scar a lifetime. Afterward, he withdrew, not theatrically, but with the quiet devastation of a man whose world had collapsed inward. Those close to him said his eyes were never the same again. The light that once matched Carole's spark had dimmed. Carole Lombard was honored as the first American woman to die in the line of duty during World War II's home front efforts. President Roosevelt praised her patriotism. The nation mourned her publicly, but Hollywood mourned her in a more intimate way, not just as a star, but as a woman who had reshaped the industry through intellect, humor, authenticity, and courage. Her final film, To Be or Not to Be, was released after her death. Watching it became both a celebration and a wound. On screen, she was luminous, sharp, elegant, playful, alive. She had filmed it with her usual precision and boldness, unaware that it would become her cinematic farewell. The film's brilliance made the loss sharper. Audiences were confronted with the undeniable truth that they had not only lost a performer, but a singular, irreplaceable voice in comedic history. Over time, Carole Lombard became more than an actress who died young. She became a symbol of what Hollywood rarely achieves, a balance of beauty, brain, bravery, and heart. She was witty without cruelty, glamorous without arrogance, vulnerable without weakness. She elevated comedy to the realm of artistry, proving that intelligence and humor were the most potent combination an actress could possess. Her legacy is felt not just in films, but in the women who followed, performers who dared to be sharp, loud, funny, messy, brilliant, who dared to be more than decoration. She gave permission for women to fill the screen without apology. And then there is the legacy she left in Clark Gable. After her death, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces, determined to serve his country. Many believed it was grief that drove him, a desire to face danger as she had, to honor her courage, or perhaps to run towards something that made sense in a world without her. He flew missions over Europe, carrying her memory like a compass engraved on his heart. Carole Lombard did not fade quietly. Her departure was sudden, violent, and far too soon, but her presence endures with remarkable clarity. She remains the woman who laughed loudly, loved fiercely, worked relentlessly, and lived with a velocity that defied the era she inhabited. Some stars dim slowly. Carole exploded, and the sky has never forgotten the light she left behind. Carole Lombard's story is one of those rare Hollywood truths that feels more like legend than memory. A life lived so boldly, so brilliantly, that even its ending carries the shape of myth. She was a woman who turned adversity into fuel, who transformed a career-threatening scar into the cornerstone of her reinvention, who refused to be molded by a system that demanded perfection but couldn't contain her fire. In an era defined by polished surfaces and studio-crafted illusions, Carole insisted on being real, raw, witty, modern, and luminously alive. Her laughter was more than sound. It was a lifeline. Her intelligence was more than charm. It was a weapon. And her heart, fierce, loyal, and unguarded, was what made her unforgettable. She moved through life with a pace that felt almost prophetic, as if she sensed time would never grant her the luxury of slowing down. She loved intensely, worked relentlessly, fought bravely, and lived with a freedom that many only dream about. The world remembers the tragedy of the crash, but her legacy is not defined by the mountain where her journey ended. It lives in the sparkle of every screwball comedy that dares to be fast and fearless. It lives in every actress who refuses to shrink herself to fit expectations. It lives in the enduring image of a woman who refused to let fear or fate dictate the course of her life. Carole Lombard did not simply pass through Hollywood. She carved a path through it, leaving behind a trail of humor, courage, brilliance, and light. And though fate claimed her far too soon, she remains eternal in the way all truly great stars do, not as a memory that fades, but as a presence that lingers. Some lights go out. Carole Lombard's continues to burn.